A few years ago, my community outreach pastor came to me with a request for a flyer for an upcoming event. The target demographic was a small, very low income, rough area in Grand Rapids that our church has been doing a lot of targeted work with. He really wanted the flyer to feel raw and homegrown, like it was made in that community. It couldn't be too clean or professional because it didn't match the culture it was built for. Now, I learned how to do graphic design in the early 2000s. Grunge is my frickin' thing. I have unironically used both Birth of a Hero and Bleeding Cowboys on multiple pieces in my lifetime. This is not an endorsement of those fonts, by the way. After throwing around ideas for a couple hours though, I had a bit of an epiphany. Though grunging something up can make it feel raw, it still feels professional. Like, not anybody can pull something like that off. There's almost this feeling of a lack of honesty to it. That sort of effect didn't feel like it was made in that community. It looks like it was made for that community by people who didn't understand it. Do you know what we ended up with? Something that looks a lot like this. By every graphic design standard I've ever learned, it's a pretty bad flyer. There's no hierarchy, there's no color, there's nothing to draw the eye. But at the end of the day, my job isn't to make flyers. My job is to get people in the door, and that's exactly what we did. The term production value isn't something I likely have to define for anyone watching this channel. For most of us, it's what we aim for. It's what we specialize in, or maybe what we hope to have one day. It's a measurement of progress, of excellence. It's the grade we receive at the end of the day on whether or not the cues were fired on time, the bulletins were made out of the right kind of paper, the guitar mix was just right, or the website animations were responsive. They're little subconscious signals that tell our audience, hey, don't worry, we know what we're doing, you can trust us. It's not a bad thing. I went to school to learn how to improve the production value of nearly everything I do. I've spent years practicing and improving and cleaning up my work a little bit more every time. But again, my job isn't to make flyers. My job is to get people to show up. Sometimes that means making flyers, sure, but the craft of graphic design is just a tool on my belt for engaging audiences and prepping them for ministry. I could bring Paul Rand, one of the greatest, most prolific graphic designers of all time, back from the dead and give him $100,000 to make the most well-designed, beautifully constructed invite flyer of all time. And if it doesn't get anybody actually in the door, it would all be for nothing. Here's the point. Excellence in your chosen craft, whether that be design or video or production or front of house sound or directing or whatever, is not your job. Using those tools to communicate the love of Christ is. Now, yeah, that sounds fine in theory, but how am I supposed to communicate the love of Christ with a frickin' soundboard? Now, hold on. You think I would only have one example? There's at least like 7 minutes left in the rest of the video. That was a total guess, but a couple of you checked. And honestly, I live for that. A few years ago, a tornado blew through the suburbs of Grand Rapids and knocked out power to half the city, including my church. Of course, of all the days to do it, had to be a Saturday afternoon, and we didn't have power back on until a couple days later. But we had service anyway. We got a couple of those emergency generators, which was just enough power to power some of those work lamps and a tiny sound travel system. By the standard of any typical Sunday morning, the production value of that Sunday was absolute garbage. I happened to be the drummer for that Sunday, and I had to play the drums via an actual keyboard sending MIDI signals to a computer with drum sounds. I had to memorize which key played which sound. There was no velocity control, of course, and I kept mixing up the kick and the snare keys. It was absolutely awful. I mean, we literally live streamed that service from an iPhone from the front row before it was cool. Trend-setting, I tell you. But you know what? There was something special about that service. There was something uniquely honest about it. I mean, it was hard to watch. It was certainly hard to hear, but it didn't turn people away. It made them lean in. Did we continue having services like that after the power turned back on? Of course not. But this video isn't an attack on production value altogether. It's an attack on the worship of it.
How you going to get out of this scene?
Oh, look at that jump. I think that this is especially important when we start talking about online ministry in general. As ridiculous as it sounds, intentionally poor production value is a core part of the culture in online spaces. I don't think we have to look any further than just memes in general to see that. Do you think any of the most popular memes are popular because they're going to be winning graphic design competitions anytime soon? Of course not. Somewhat lazy, careless graphic design is actually subtext that communicates to the audience, I'm just like you. You could have done this. I'm relatable. And that's why commercials like this
Eat spicy goodness like a boss.
are horrifyingly cringy. It no longer feels relatable. It's no longer a part of the in-group anymore. As much as I'm incredibly hesitant to use the phrase, it sort of reminds me of like cultural appropriation or something. It's an outsider using the imagery of a culture without understanding and recognizing what makes it important and valuable. When we as churches put production value on a pedestal above effective communication, we're not only likely making a fool of ourselves, but we're making the decision that our church's perceived brand and value is more important than reaching people where they're at, getting on their level, and making sure we're communicating effectively. I think I'm going to take the next paragraph in a different room. I'm at my in-laws' house this weekend, so you guys are just going to get a tour of the house. Now, not to get too preachy, but I think there's an argument to be made that our obsession with production value is more a symptom of a larger problem than the root itself. Christians have an image problem, and I don't necessarily mean Christians at large, although that's a problem for another day. I mean Christians individually. There seems to be something weirdly programmed into our brains that's telling us that being made in the image of God means that we need to convince everybody else that we're just as perfect as Him. There's a reason so many in the world think we're fake. It's because that the image we're showing them, whether that be professionally or personally or corporately, often is. Taking a more tailored approach at production value isn't just about being more relatable. It's about humanizing Christianity. It's about making a relationship with Christ feel achievable and personal. It's about being Jesus with skin on, not just from the pulpit, but from our living rooms and from our front yards, humanity and all. I'd like to challenge each and every one of you watching this video to take a look at your portfolio. In what elements of what you do are you prioritizing the status or perceived value of your church over effective, direct communication with your audience? Again, I'm not saying that production value is a bad thing. I work at a large church with relatively large budget for all things tech and music and media and more. But that doesn't mean that every once in a while our pastor doesn't hop on a Facebook Live with his iPhone from his living room, and our pastors don't answer questions from their offices at home. We've had acoustic services out under tents. We've made promo videos that feel intentionally awful, and we make flyers that occasionally look like this. Like always, know who your audience is, know what you want them to feel, and know why they should care. Thanks so much for watching this episode of Blackbar. If you haven't already, make sure to check out the Blackbar podcast, released every single week, where we go more into depth into the topics we talk about in these videos. In addition, if you would like to join the Blackbar volunteer team and help make content or help other struggling churches on our Discord, make sure to check out the link in the description below. Make sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next week.